Looking ahead, the interplay between military pressure and diplomacy will continue to shape the trajectory of U.S.-Iran relations, with the outcome of current nuclear negotiations in Geneva likely to have lasting effects on regional stability and international security. Observers note that the United States has explicitly maintained that while diplomacy is the preferred route, it reserves the right to pursue military options if talks falter, a stance reinforced by the scale of its current force posture in the Middle East. Washington's insistence that negotiations include broader issues, including ballistic missile development and regional influence, may complicate efforts to achieve a narrow nuclear deal, but reflects broader strategic concerns about Iran's role in regional conflicts and support for allied militia networks. On Iran's side, leadership statements stress that any agreement must respect Iran's sovereign rights and avoid conditions that could undermine its security autonomy, a position that underscores Tehran's sensitivity to external pressure and regional encirclement narratives. The continuation of indirect negotiations in Geneva, even amid escalating military deployments, suggests that both capitals recognize the catastrophic risks of open conflict and are testing whether a framework for compromise can be found. International actors and mediators will likely remain engaged, offering technical assistance, verification expertise, and diplomatic channels to bridge gaps between the negotiating positions. Ultimately, the path ahead may hinge on whether Iran is willing to offer verifiable limits on enrichment and grant broader inspection access to satisfy non-proliferation concerns, and whether the United States is prepared to translate sanctions relief and diplomatic recognition into tangible incentives that Tehran deems sufficient. Even if a partial agreement is reached, unresolved tensions over missiles and regional policy could continue to fuel distrust, requiring ongoing engagement and confidence-building measures. Conversely, failure to reach a negotiated settlement could embolden hardliners on both sides, increasing the probability of military miscalculation with significant regional and global repercussions. The current moment represents a critical juncture in U.S.-Iran relations, where the outcomes of talks and the management of military pressures will profoundly influence whether the region moves toward de-escalation, protracted tension, or outright conflict, and will test the capacity of international diplomacy to contain one of the most enduring flashpoints in contemporary geopolitics. The geopolitical stakes of the U.S.-Iran standoff extend far beyond bilateral relations, involving regional security dynamics, energy markets, and broader global non-proliferation objectives, according to multiple international sources. The Middle East remains a volatile theater, where U.S. military deployments and Iranian military exercises reverberate through alliances and rivalries. The presence of American carrier strike groups and advanced aerial assets is intended to reassure U.S. partners, such as the Gulf Arab states, Israel, and NATO allies, while deterring perceived Iranian adventurism. However, these same deployments have fueled concern among some regional governments about the risk of unintended escalation, given Iran's capabilities and its capacity to disrupt maritime traffic through choke points such as the Strait of Hormuz. Israel, a close U.S. ally and vocal critic of Iran's nuclear ambitions, has publicly called for any nuclear agreement to include a dismantling of key Iranian nuclear infrastructure, not just limitations on enrichment. Regional dialogue remains fraught, with some Gulf states pushing for diplomacy to avoid conflict, while others emphasize the need to address Iran's missile program and proxy networks alongside its nuclear activities. Beyond the Middle East, global markets monitor developments closely, as Iran's strategic position along major energy export routes means that any conflict could have serious implications for the price and flow of oil and gas worldwide. International institutions like the International Atomic Energy Agency and global powers, such as China and Russia, also have interest in the outcome of negotiations, with mixed motivations ranging from non-proliferation goals to strategic balancing in global politics. The resurgence of nuclear talks underlines a shared international interest in containing nuclear risks and avoiding a broader war, even as the hardline rhetoric from Tehran and Washington underscores the difficulty of reconciling divergent strategic priorities. Diplomatic efforts by mediators such as Oman and pressure from international organizations highlight a recognition that sustained conflict could destabilize an already fragile region, prompting renewed calls for compromise and guarantees that any agreement will be verifiable and durable. The evolving interaction between military posturing and diplomatic negotiation reveals the complexity of managing a crisis with deep historical roots, significant regional implications, and potential global consequences. Iran's leadership has publicly responded to U.S. military pressure and diplomatic demands with a combination of defiance, strategic signaling, and insistence on its sovereign rights, according to international reporting. Iranian officials, including Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi and President Masoud Pezeshkian, have stressed that Tehran will not be intimidated by an increased U.S. presence in the region and that military deployments do not alter Iran's determination to pursue its national interests. Araghchi has declared that the U.S. military buildup, including the arrival of an aircraft carrier armada, does not scare Tehran and that Iran will continue its uranium enrichment even in the face of threats, framing the nuclear program as a legal right rather than evidence of weaponization. In parallel with diplomatic engagement, Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps has conducted naval drills in the strategically vital Strait of Hormuz, testing readiness and signaling its capacity to challenge external pressure. Iran has also begun other military exercises, underlining its preparedness to respond to any form of aggression. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has echoed these themes, warning that any U.S. military action would trigger a broader regional conflict and vowing that Iran is ready to defend itself against coercive measures. Iranian rhetoric emphasizes that Tehran seeks peaceful resolution through negotiation, but not at the expense of its national dignity or core security interests. Tehran's insistence that talks focus solely on nuclear matters and not on its missile programs or regional alliances reflects a broader strategy to compartmentalize negotiations and safeguard its strategic posture. Domestic factors, including significant public anger over a domestic crackdown on protests, also shape Iran's external messaging, as Tehran attempts to project strength internationally while managing internal dissent. Iranian officials have alternately welcomed diplomatic progress as a step forward, while dismissing external pressure as ineffective, maintaining that Iran will negotiate only as an equal party and will resist demands perceived as undermining its sovereignty. This assertive stance underscores a deep mutual mistrust between Tehran and Washington, even as diplomats on both sides continue to engage in structured talks to prevent military conflict. Against the backdrop of this military buildup, the United States and Iran have resumed indirect nuclear negotiations in Geneva aimed at preventing further escalation and reaching a deal on Tehran's nuclear program. These talks represent the latest round in a multi-stage diplomatic effort that follows earlier meetings in Oman and other venues, and they're being framed by U.S. and Iranian officials as crucial to averting conflict. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has met with International Atomic Energy Agency Director General Rafael Grossi to discuss technical aspects of Iran's nuclear activities, including enriched uranium stockpiles and inspection access, after previous tensions led to reduced cooperation with the IAEA. Tehran insists that negotiations should focus strictly on its nuclear program, asserting its right under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty to pursue enrichment for peaceful purposes and seeking sanctions relief in exchange for limits on enrichment levels and transparency measures. U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, along with senior advisors such as Jared Kushner, represent Washington in these discussions, which also involve concerns about the pace of Iran's uranium enrichment and the adequacy of verification mechanisms. While the Iranian delegation professes readiness for a fair and equitable deal that recognizes its sovereign interests, U.S. officials and some regional partners argue that the agenda should extend to Iran's ballistic missile programs and regional influence, matters Tehran has repeatedly rejected as negotiable. President Trump has stated publicly that a meaningful agreement must be reached quickly, warning that failure to do so could have very tough consequences for Iran, and that negotiations could conclude within a matter of weeks if both sides engage constructively. As part of this diplomatic pressure, the U.S. has also requested more rigorous monitoring and clarity on Iran's nuclear inventory, reflecting broader international concerns over Tehran's capacity to produce weapons-usable material if enrichment continues unchecked. Regional states and international mediators, such as Oman, have played a backdrop role in pushing for dialogue and de-escalation, aware that a breakdown in talks could dramatically heighten the risk of military confrontation. The negotiations have unfolded in a highly charged atmosphere, with both sides signaling that diplomacy remains possible but contingent on substantive concessions and verification commitments. The United States has dramatically intensified its military presence across the Middle East amid rising tensions with Iran as indirect nuclear talks approach in Geneva, marking one of the largest force buildups in the region in recent years. According to international reporting, the Pentagon and U.S. Central Command have ordered significant deployments of air and naval assets designed both to deter instability and to prepare for potential offensive operations if diplomacy fails. This buildup includes multiple aircraft carriers, specifically the USS Abraham Lincoln already positioned in the Arabian Sea and the USS Gerald R. Ford ordered to join it, alongside warships, fighter aircraft, transport planes, and extensive cargo flights ferrying equipment to bases in Jordan, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia. U.S. Central Command assets now encompass several carrier strike groups, destroyers, and missile defense systems, reflecting an assertive stance aimed at projecting power near Iran's borders and sea approaches. According to CNN and other outlets, more than 250 U.S. cargo flights have delivered military equipment to forward bases, with capabilities ranging from aerial refueling and strike aircraft to P-8 surveillance planes and Patriots and THAAD missile batteries intended for defensive and offensive roles alike. Washington's publicly stated objectives include deterring Iranian retaliation, compelling Tehran toward concessions and negotiations, protecting regional allies, and ensuring free navigation through strategic waterways, such as the Strait of Hormuz, through which a significant share of the world's oil transits. While U.S. officials continue to emphasize that diplomatic solutions remain preferable, President Donald Trump and his advisors have explicitly kept all options on the table, and recent reporting indicates that the Pentagon is examining a range of potential military scenarios spanning airstrikes, limited ground operations, and even special forces missions. This demonstrative buildup, described by some Western analysts as both a negotiating lever and a contingency posture, has significantly escalated the stakes of a crisis that follows several years of mutual distrust and intermittent conflict between Tehran and Washington. The massive scale of U.S. military logistics and hardware movements underscores the seriousness with which Washington is treating both the risk of conflict and the opportunity for negotiated settlement ahead of the Geneva nuclear talks.